The blade-like winter wind sliced through the frozen air, carrying the metallic scent of blood across the snow-blanketed clearing. Eyvindr Braço-de-Ferro knelt beside the lifeless body of Gunnar, his last loyal friend, watching crimson stains spread across virgin snow. Through the haze of his ragged breath, he glimpsed torches flickering between distant pines. The hunting party was closing in. Hatred and desperation warred in his chest as he reached for his blade, prepared to make his final stand. Then, cutting through the silence like a whisper from Valhalla itself, came a sound that froze his blood more effectively than any northern gale. A soft, unmistakable whimper emanating from the darkness of the forest edge. Hours earlier, as dawn's weak light struggled to penetrate the heavy cloud cover, Eyvindr had awoken in his isolated cabin on the outskirts of Skjoldheim. The 38 winters he had survived were etched into his face, not just in the lines around his eyes or the weathering of his skin, but in the haunted depth of his gaze. His once proud shoulders, which had carried the mantle of Jarl with dignity, now hunched slightly against the perpetual cold that seemed to seep into his very marrow. He stirred the dying embers in his hearth, coaxing reluctant flames from the ash. The cabin creaked and moaned against the wind, its aging timbers offering meager protection against the elements. Through gaps in the wooden walls, winter invaded his sanctuary, a constant reminder that nothing in his life remained secure or sealed against misfortune. The smell of old smoke, damp furs, and the lingering scent of the previous night's meager meal hung in the stagnant air. "Another day," he muttered to himself, the words forming clouds in the frigid air. "Another day in exile." His fingers, calloused yet still deft, worked through the ritual of braiding his dark hair. Each movement was mechanical, performed without thought, allowing his mind to wander down well-worn paths of memory. The great hall of his ancestors filled his mind's eye, torch-lit, warm, alive with laughter and song. Then came the bitter recollection of his brother Sigurd, rising at the harvest feast, voice thick with mead, but eyes clear with calculated malice. "My brother hoards the spoils of our raids," Sigurd had shouted, his voice echoing off ancient timbers. "He negotiates with our enemies while our warriors' bodies cool on foreign shores." The accusations had been crafted with precision, half-truths twisted into damning lies. The council of elders, many already in Sigurd's debt or bed, had nodded gravely. By morning, Eyvindr's fate had been sealed, stripped of title, lands, and honor. Exiled under threat of death should he ever attempt to reclaim his birthright. Eyvindr's hand paused in its braiding as the memory of his wife's face surfaced. Helga, with her fierce eyes and gentle hands, who had chosen to remain with their children rather than follow him into exile. He could not blame her. What mother would choose disgrace and hardship for her children when they could retain some measure of status under their uncle's protection? A sharp crack from outside snapped him from his reverie. Instinctively, his hand moved to the seax blade at his hip as he approached the single window. Through its clouded animal skin covering, he surveyed the tree line that bordered his meager plot of land. Movement caught his eye, not the familiar shift of branches in the wind, but something deliberate, human. He stepped outside, the snow crunching beneath his worn boots. The village of Skjoldheim lay a fair distance away, its smoke rising in thin columns against the gray sky. Few villagers ventured this far from the settlement, especially in winter. Those who did usually came bearing threats or demands for tribute, testing the boundaries of his exile. "Show yourself," he called, his voice carrying across the clearing. For a moment there was only silence. Then the underbrush parted and a figure stumbled forward, a young woman, barely more than a girl. Her pale blonde hair, partially escaped from a simple binding, whipped around her face in the wind. Her clothing, once fine, but now torn and soiled, spoke of hardship and flight. Blood, fresh and dried, stained her sleeve and smeared across her cheek. Eyvindr remained motionless, wary of deception. In his experience, nothing was as it appeared, especially when it appealed to one's better nature. Yet something in the girl's eyes, wide, frightened, but with a stubborn spark of life, stirred something long dormant within him. She took another stumbling step forward before her legs gave way. As she fell to her knees in the snow, Eyvindr noticed her white-knuckled grip on something, a broken pendant or amulet, clutched as though it were her last connection to a world that had vanished. "Please," she whispered, in a dialect he recognized as belonging to the northern fjords, "help me." Every instinct honed through years of leadership and survival screamed caution. Taking in a stranger meant questions from the village. Questions meant attention. Attention meant danger. The council's warning had been explicit. Any disruption, any challenge to their authority would be met with a blade across his throat. And yet, Eyvindr glanced back at his cabin, small, drafty, barely sufficient for one, let alone two. Then his gaze returned to the girl, trembling now, not just from fear, but from the cold seeping through her inadequate clothing. In her face he saw echoes of his own daughter, left behind when he was cast out. The thought of Sigrid facing such circumstances, alone and desperate, decided him. With 3 long strides he closed the distance between them. Kneeling, he removed his outer fur and wrapped it around her shoulders. She flinched at his approach, but did not resist his assistance. "I am Eyvindr," he said simply. "Can you walk?" She nodded weakly. He helped her to her feet, supporting her weight as they moved toward the cabin. As they crossed the threshold, he cast one final glance at the forest and the path that led to the village. His decision had been made. Whatever consequences followed, he would face them. Inside, he guided her to the lone chair near the hearth. The fire had caught properly now, casting dancing shadows across the sparse interior. A wooden table, a sleeping pallet, shelves bearing the few possessions he'd managed to salvage or craft during his exile. Weapons hung on the walls, not as decoration, but as necessities. A shield, a long-handled axe, several knives of varying sizes. The girl's eyes darted around the space, assessing, calculating. Despite her weakened state, Eyvindr recognized the alertness of one accustomed to danger. She was evaluating escape routes, weapons within reach, the man who now controlled her fate. "You're safe here," he said, though they both knew such promises were fragile things in this world. "What's your name?" She hesitated, clearly weighing the risk of truth against the convenience of lies. "Freyja," she finally said, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "Freyja Valkyrsdóttir." The patronymic caught his attention. Valkyr was not a common name, but one he had heard before. A chieftain from the coastal regions far to the north, known for his skill in shipbuilding and his ruthlessness in battle. "You're a long way from home, Freyja Valkyrsdóttir," he observed, moving to fetch a wooden cup of water. Her fingers tightened around the broken pendant. Home is gone, she said simply, the words carrying the weight of irreversible loss. Eyvindr nodded, understanding all too well. He handed her the water and watched as she drank greedily, her throat working as she gulped down the liquid. When she finished, he took the cup and refilled it. "Are you hungry?" he asked. She nodded, her eyes following his movements as he moved to a small storage chest. He retrieved a loaf of hard bread, a piece of dried fish, and a small pot of honey, a luxury he rarely indulged in, saved for the darkest days when memories threatened to overwhelm him. As he prepared the simple meal, he observed her from the corner of his eye. Her clothing, though damaged, was of good quality. The pendant she clutched bore unfamiliar runes, possibly protective sigils or family markings. Most telling were her hands, not those of a thrall or common laborer, but a woman of rank who had known comfort, if not luxury. "Who pursues you?" he asked, directly, placing the food before her. Freyja's eyes darted to the door, before returning to his face. "Men who serve the one who destroyed my father's hall," she replied carefully. "They believe I carry something of value. Do you?" Her hand moved to her side, where Eyvindr noticed a small leather pouch secured beneath her belt. "Knowledge," she said. "Names, alliances, things worth killing for." Eyvindr nodded slowly. Politics and power, the games that had cost him everything. "Eat," he said, gesturing to the food. "Then rest. We'll speak more when you've regained your strength." As she ate with the controlled desperation of one who had gone too long without food, Eyvindr moved to the door. Opening it slightly, he scanned the tree line again. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the promise of more snow. Good. Fresh snowfall would cover her tracks, buying them time. But time for what, he wondered. What was he to do with this girl, this complication? Skjoldheim tolerated his presence only because he remained invisible, unobtrusive. A strange woman appearing in his cabin would draw attention, questions. The village headman, Hakon Olhastekorvo, had made it clear that Eyvindr's continued existence depended on his absolute compliance with the terms of his exile. When he turned back, he found Freyja watching him, her gaze steadier now that food and warmth had revived her. "You risk much by sheltering me," she observed. Eyvindr gave a humorless laugh. "I have little left to lose." "All men have something to lose," she countered, "even if only their lives." He couldn't argue with that. Life, however diminished, was still preferable to the cold embrace of death. Yet something in him had shifted when he saw her stumbling from the forest. A reawakening of the man he had once been, the Jarl who protected rather than merely survived. "Rest," he repeated, indicating his sleeping pallet. "I'll keep watch." She hesitated before moving to the bed. "They'll come looking," she warned, settling onto the furs. "When they find me, they'll kill anyone who stands in their way." Eyvindr's hand moved to the sea-axe at his belt. "I am not so easily killed." For the first time, a ghost of a smile touched her lips. "No," she agreed, studying his scarred hands and weathered face. "I don't imagine you are." As Freyja drifted into an exhausted sleep, Eyvindr settled on a stool near the door, his blade across his knees. Outside, the wind howled, carrying the first flakes of new snow. He found himself wondering what Helga would think of his decision, she who had always accused him of thinking too much of honor and too little of survival. "Some habits," he murmured to himself, "are too deeply ingrained to break." The rest of the day passed in uneasy vigilance. Eyvindr ventured out only briefly to gather more firewood and check for signs of pursuit.
The snow fell steadily, erasing Freyja's trail, and, he hoped, buying them at least until morning before questions would arise.
As dusk settled over the forest, turning the world to deepening shades of blue and gray, Eyvindr's old friend Gunnar appeared at the edge of the clearing. A hulking man with a graying beard and hands like hammers, Gunnar had been Eyvindr's shield-bearer in better days. Now he made his living as a trapper, one of the few from Eyvindr's former life who still acknowledged their connection. Eyvindr stepped outside to meet him, closing the cabin door firmly behind him. "You have company," Gunnar said without preamble, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "How do you know?" Gunnar snorted. "2 sets of tracks leading to your door this morning, before the snow covered them. Unless you've grown an extra pair of feet, someone's sharing your hospitality." Eyvindr weighed his options before nodding slightly. "A girl," he admitted, "injured, fleeing from something or someone." "Hakon's men were in the village today," Gunnar said, his voice low, "asking about strangers, especially a young woman. They didn't come from our fjord, Eyvindr. Their accents were northern, their weapons expensive." A chill that had nothing to do with the winter air settled in Eyvindr's stomach. "How many?" "6 that I saw, well armed. They spoke with Hakon for some time." Gunnar's heavy brows drew together. "Whatever trouble she's in, it's not the kind that passes quickly." Eyvindr glanced back at the cabin. "She'll be gone tomorrow," he decided. "I'll give her food, directions to the next settlement." Gunnar's weathered face creased with concern. "These aren't men who give up easily. If they track her here—" "They won't," Eyvindr interrupted. "The snow will hide her path. And if they're already suspicious of you, Hakon has never needed much reason to act against you." Eyvindr's jaw tightened. "Then I'll deal with that when it comes." Gunnar sighed heavily, his massive shoulders slumping. "You never did know when to back down from a fight." He reached into his fur-lined jacket and produced a small package wrapped in oiled leather. "Smoked venison. I was going to trade it in the village, but—" He extended it to Eyvindr. "Sounds like you might need it more." Eyvindr accepted the offering with a nod of gratitude. "Thank you, old friend." "Don't thank me yet," Gunnar warned. "If Hakon decides you've broken the terms of your exile, gratitude won't keep your head on your shoulders." He glanced at the darkening sky. "I should go before the light fails completely. Be careful, Eyvindr. The girl may be innocent, but that doesn't mean she isn't dangerous." After Gunnar departed, Eyvindr remained outside for a long moment, staring at the path that led toward the village. The snow was falling more heavily now, thick flakes swirling in the wind. He thought of Freyja's words, "Home is gone," and felt the echo of that loss in his own chest. When he re-entered the cabin, he found Freyja awake, sitting up on the pallet. Her color had improved, though wariness still sharpened her gaze. "Someone came," she said. It wasn't a question. "A friend," Eyvindr replied, setting the venison on the table. "But he brings news I don't care for. Men from the north were in the village today, asking about a young woman." Fear flashed across her face before she mastered it. "How many?" "6, at least, well armed and determined." She closed her eyes briefly. "They work for Bjorn Quebra Joramentos, the man who burned my father's hall and slaughtered my kin." "Why does he hunt you so persistently?" Freyja's hand moved to the pouch at her side. "My father was a shipbuilder, but also a record-keeper. He documented alliances, betrayals, blood debts, the secret history of the northern clans. Before our hull burned, I took his records." Her eyes met Eyvindr's, unflinching. "Names of those who have allied with Bjorn, raids planned against settlements to the east, arrangements with foreign merchants for weapons and men." Eyvindr understood immediately. Information that could unite his enemies against him. She nodded. Or end his ambitions entirely if it reached the right hands. And so you fled south. I had nowhere else to go, she admitted. My father's allies were either dead or had already pledged to Bjorn. I thought if I could reach the southern settlements, find someone with enough power and reason to move against him. Eyvindr laughed without humor. Then you've come to the wrong place, and certainly the wrong man. I have no power here. Yet you were once a Jarl, she observed. I see it in how you carry yourself, how you speak. He turned away, uncomfortable with her perception. That life is gone. Why? She pressed. What crime earned you exile? The greatest crime of all, he replied bitterly. I trusted my brother. Outside, the wind rose to a howl, rattling the shutters of the small window. Eyvindr moved to secure them, grateful for the momentary distraction from memories that still had the power to wound. You should eat, he said, changing the subject. My friend brought venison. It will help restore your strength. As they shared the meal in the flickering firelight, Eyvindr found himself studying Freyja more carefully. Despite her youth and the fear that occasionally shadowed her eyes, there was a resilience to her that he respected. She had survived the destruction of her world and fled across hostile territory with nothing but her wits and determination. Tomorrow, he said, as they finished eating, I'll give you provisions and direct you to the next settlement. It's 3 days' journey, but the path is clear enough if you know what to look for. She looked up sharply. You're sending me away? It's not safe for you here, he explained. The village headman, Håkon, has never needed much reason to move against me. If he discovers I'm harboring a fugitive, then I'll be responsible for your death, she finished quietly. Eyvindr didn't contradict her. They both understood the reality of their situation. I'm sorry, she said after a moment. I never meant to bring danger to your door. Danger and I are old companions, he replied with a grim smile. But there's no sense in courting it unnecessarily. Freyja nodded, though something like disappointment flickered across her face. I understand, and I'm grateful for what you've already done. As night deepened around the cabin, Eyvindr insisted Freyja keep the pallet while he settled near the fire, his back against the wall. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by every creak of timber and gust of wind. Each time he opened his eyes, he found himself checking that Freyja was still there, half expecting her to have slipped away into the night rather than wait for morning. But she remained, her breathing even in sleep, one hand still curled protectively around the pouch at her side. In the dying firelight, with her guard lowered by exhaustion, she looked impossibly young, a harsh reminder of the cruelty of their world, where even children learned early that survival often came at a terrible price. Sometime in the darkest hour of night, Eyvindr finally drifted into deeper sleep. He dreamed of his hall as it once was, filled with light and laughter, his wife by his side, his children playing at his feet. In the dream, he turned to speak to Helga, but when she faced him, it was Freyja's eyes that met his, clear, direct, unafraid. He woke with a start to the sound of approaching horses. Dawn had barely broken, the light weak and gray through the shuttered window. Freyja was already awake, standing tensely near the door, her few possessions gathered. They're coming, she whispered, her face pale but composed. Eyvindr rose quickly, reaching for his weapons. How many? I heard at least 3 horses, maybe more. He moved to the window, carefully peering through a crack. Through the gently falling snow, he could make out a group of riders approaching from the direction of the village. At their head rode Håkon Olhos de Corvo, his dark cloak billowing behind him, the iron circlet that marked his authority gleaming dully against his black hair. It's the headman, Eyvindr confirmed, and 4 others. He recognized 2 as village council members, the others as Haakon's personal guards, men chosen more for their loyalty than their wisdom. "What will you tell them?" Freyja asked, her voice steady despite the fear evident in her eyes. Eyvindr considered his options, none of them good. Lying would only delay the inevitable. Haakon would search the cabin regardless of what Eyvindr claimed. Fighting was suicide against 5 armed men. Flight might be possible for Freyja, but not for both of them, and certainly not without being seen. The truth, he decided finally, or enough of it to satisfy them. And if it doesn't? He met her gaze directly. Then we face what comes. The riders halted outside the cabin, their horses stamping and snorting in the cold. Eyvindr took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. "Stay behind me," he instructed Freyja. "Speak only if spoken to, and reveal nothing about your father's records." She nodded, her hand moving to the pouch at her side, as though to reassure herself it remained secure. Eyvindr opened the door and stepped outside, deliberately leaving his weapons within reach but not in hand, a gesture of neither submission nor defiance. Haakon dismounted, his movements fluid despite the cold. At 45, he remained an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, his face marked by the deep scar that ran from his right temple to his jaw. "Eyvindr Braço-de-Ferro," Haakon greeted him, his voice carrying the particular inflection of one who enjoyed the sound of his own authority. "It seems you've been busy in your isolation." "Haakon," Eyvindr acknowledged with a slight nod. "What brings the council to my door so early?" Haakon's cold gray eyes shifted to the cabin behind Eyvindr. "Strangers in our territory, specifically a young woman from the northern clans." His gaze returned to Eyvindr's face, searching for any reaction. "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Eyvindr maintained a neutral expression. "I found a girl yesterday, injured and half frozen. I gave her shelter for the night." Murmurs rose from the men behind Haakon. One of the council members, Torsten the Miller, spat into the snow. "So you admit to harboring outsiders against the terms of your exile?" "The terms of my exile forbid me from challenging the council's authority or returning to my former position," Eyvindr corrected evenly. "They say nothing about basic human decency." "Human decency," Haakon repeated, a mocking edge to his voice. "A convenient interpretation. And where is this guest now?" Instead of answering, Eyvindr stepped aside, revealing Freyja, who stood in the doorway. She had straightened her clothing and hair as best she could, and despite her obvious fear, she held herself with a dignity that spoke of her upbringing. Haakon's eyes narrowed as he assessed her. "What is your name, girl?" "Freyja Valkyrsdottir," she replied, her voice clear despite its softness. Recognition flickered across Haakon's face. "Valkyr, the shipbuilder from the northern fjords." When she nodded, he continued, "I heard his hall was burned. A dispute over territory, they said." "A massacre," Freyja corrected, a flash of anger breaking through her composed exterior. "Bjorn Quebra Juramontos and his men came at night. They killed everyone, even the children and elders." "Yet you survived?" Haakon observed, his tone suggesting this was somehow suspicious. "I was not in the hall when they came. I was—" She hesitated, clearly weighing her words. "Gathering herbs in the forest. When I returned, everything was burning. Everyone was dead." "A convenient absence," one of Haakon's guards remarked. Freyja's chin lifted slightly. "There was nothing convenient about watching my home burn with my family inside." Håkon studied her for a long moment before turning back to Eyvindr. You realize, of course, that men have come looking for her, important men with significant resources at their disposal. I gathered as much, Eyvindr replied carefully. They offer a substantial reward for her return. Håkon continued, watching Eyvindr's reaction closely. Gold, trade goods, political favors, things that would benefit Skjoldheim greatly during these harsh winter months. Eyvindr felt rather than saw Freyja stiffened behind him. And what do they want with her? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Håkon shrugged, the gesture deliberately casual. They didn't specify. Family business, they called it. She says they massacred her kin, Eyvindr pointed out. That makes their family business rather clear, doesn't it? She says many things, Håkon countered. A girl, alone, desperate, seeking shelter. Who knows what tales she might spin to secure protection? He took a step closer, lowering his voice. You, of all people, should understand the danger of accepting someone's story without question, Eyvindr. Wasn't it misplaced trust that cost you everything? The barb struck deep, as Håkon had intended. Eyvindr's jaw tightened, but he refused to rise to the provocation. What do you want, Håkon? You didn't ride out here in the snow simply to warn me about mysterious strangers. No, Håkon agreed, his expression hardening. I came to uphold the law. The girl comes with us, back to the village. The council will decide what to do with her. And if she refuses? She doesn't have that option. Håkon's hand moved to rest meaningfully on the hilt of his sword. Nor do you have the authority to protect her. Eyvindr felt the familiar surge of anger that had so often been his downfall, the burning sense of injustice that clouded judgment and led to rash decisions. He forced himself to breathe deeply, to consider their position rationally. "I'll accompany her," he said finally. Håkon's eyebrows rose. "You are not invited to council deliberations, exile. Nevertheless, I'll come. She was under my protection when you found her. I have a right to speak on her behalf." The two men stared at each other, the old enmity between them palpable in the cold morning air. Finally, Håkon gave a curt nod. "Very well, but remember your place, Eyvindr. One wrong word, one step out of line, and your exile becomes a death sentence." As Håkon returned to his horse, Eyvindr turned to Freyja. "Gather your things," he said quietly. "We have no choice." Her eyes, wide with fear but also understanding, met his. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "This is my fault." "No," he corrected her firmly. "The fault lies with those who value power over humanity." He glanced at the pouch at her side. "Keep that hidden. It may be our only leverage." She nodded, securing the pouch beneath her clothing before following Eyvindr to where the riders waited. One of the guards dismounted and offered his horse to Freyja, though the gesture contained no kindness, merely practicality to speed their journey. Eyvindr would walk, a deliberate reminder of his diminished status. As they prepared to depart, Eyvindr noticed movement at the edge of the forest. Gunnar stood among the trees, watching the scene unfold, his expression grim. Their eyes met briefly, a wordless exchange passing between them, concern from Gunnar, resignation from Eyvindr. With a signal from Håkon, the party set off toward the village, Eyvindr trudging through the snow beside Freyja's horse. The journey was made in silence, broken only by the crunch of hooves and boots on snow and the occasional snort of a horse. Skjoldheim came into view as they crested a small rise, a collection of wooden buildings nestled in a valley, smoke rising from hearths into the gray sky. Once, Eyvindr had looked upon this village with pride and responsibility. Now he regarded it with a mixture of longing and bitterness. Villagers emerged from their homes as the party approached, drawn by curiosity and the unusual sight of the exile returning in the company of the council. Eyvindr kept his gaze forward, ignoring the whispers and stares. Beside him, Freyja sat rigid on her borrowed mount, her face a mask of controlled fear. They were led to the village hall, a long wooden building at the center of the settlement. Inside, a fire blazed in the central hearth, casting dancing shadows on the timber walls. Benches lined the sides of the hall, many already occupied by council members and village elders who had been summoned ahead of their arrival. At the far end of the hall, on a slightly raised platform, stood a carved chair. Not a true throne, but a seat of authority nonetheless. Hakon moved to take his place there, gesturing for Freyja to be brought before him. Eyvindr followed, positioning himself slightly behind her, a silent statement of support. The hall quieted as Hakon raised his hand. "We gather to address a matter of village security," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the space. "This woman," he indicated Freyja, "was found in our territory, harbored by the exile Eyvindr in violation of the terms of his punishment." Mutters rippled through the assembled villagers. Eyvindr noted the faces of those present, some curious, some hostile, a few thoughtful. Old allies, former friends, people who had once looked to him for leadership. Now they regarded him with suspicion or pity. "Furthermore," Hakon continued, "she is sought by representatives of Bjorn Quebra Juramentos, a powerful chieftain from the northern territories. They offer significant compensation for her return."
"What crime is she accused of?" called a voice from the crowd. Eyvindr recognized Leif the blacksmith, a man known for his blunt speech and sense of fairness. Hakon's expression tightened slightly at the interruption. "That is not our concern. Our duty is to our own people, to ensure their safety and prosperity. By selling a frightened girl to men who will likely kill her?" Eyvindr couldn't contain the question, though he knew it would cost him. Hakon's cold gaze fixed on him. "You forget your place, exile. You stand here by my sufferance, not by right. I stand here as a man who has not forgotten what it means to protect the vulnerable," Eyvindr countered, his voice steady despite the danger of his position. Something this council seems to have misplaced, along with its honor. A collective intake of breath followed his words. Challenging Hakon so directly, especially in public, was tantamount to suicide. But Eyvindr had reached the limit of his patience with injustice, with the pretense of law that served only the powerful. "Enough!" Hakon's voice cracked like a whip. "One more word, Eyvindr, and you'll be removed. This is not your hall to speak in." "Let her speak," suggested another elder, Gudrun, an aging healer whose opinions still carried weight. "Let us hear her story before we decide her fate." Hakon hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Very well. Speak, girl. Tell us why men from your own lands hunt you so determinedly." Freyja stepped forward slightly, her hands clasped before her to hide their trembling. In the firelight, with every eye upon her, she seemed both vulnerable and oddly powerful, a contradiction that Eyvindr found himself admiring. "My name is Freyja, Valkyr's daughter," she began, her voice soft but clear. "My father was Valkyr, the shipbuilder, a chieftain of the coastal territories in the far north. 3 weeks ago, Bjorn Quebra Juramentos and his warriors came to our hall under the banner of peace, seeking an alliance.
She paused, gathering herself before continuing. My father refused. He knew Bjorn's reputation, a man who had broken oaths before, who sought to expand his territory through treachery rather than honest conquest. That night, as our people feasted, Bjorn's men barred the doors of our hall and set it ablaze. Murmurs of shock and disgust rippled through the crowd. Even in the harsh world they inhabited, such a violation of guest right was considered abhorrent. I was not in the hall, Freyja continued. I had gone to visit my mother's grave in the forest nearby. When I returned, I saw the flames, heard the screams. Her voice faltered for the first time. My entire family, my father, my brothers, my younger sister, all gone. Our people slaughtered or enslaved. And so you fled south, Håkon supplied, his tone suggesting skepticism. Yes, she confirmed. I knew Bjorn would hunt me once he realized I had escaped. I am the last of my father's line, the only witness to his crime. A tragic tale, Håkon acknowledged, though his expression remained unmoved. But it changes nothing. The dispute is between northern clans, not our concern. It becomes our concern when we are asked to participate in murder, Eyvindr interjected, unable to remain silent. Håkon's eyes narrowed dangerously. I warned you, exile. He's right, interrupted Leif the blacksmith, rising from his seat. We cannot hand her over to the men who slaughtered her kin. It goes against everything we claim to stand for. Our first responsibility is to this village, countered Torsten the miller. The reward they offer would see us through the rest of winter without hardship. Why should we risk Bjorn's displeasure for the sake of one foreign girl? The hall erupted into argument, voices rising as villagers took sides. Eyvindr watched Håkon's face, noting the calculation behind his cold eyes. The headman had not expected this division, had counted on fear and self-interest to carry his point.
Silence! Håkon finally roared, bringing the debate to an abrupt halt. This is not a matter for common vote. The council will decide. Then let the council hear all relevant information, Eyvindr suggested, his voice deliberately calm in contrast to Håkon's outburst, including why Bjorn is so determined to find this particular survivor. Håkon's gaze sharpened. Do you know something you haven't shared, exile? Eyvindr looked to Freyja, a silent question in his eyes. She hesitated, then gave an almost imperceptible nod. Freyja carries something Bjorn wants desperately, Eyvindr explained. Information that could unite his enemies against him, expose his plans for further conquest. That's why he hunts her so relentlessly, not just to silence a witness, but to protect his ambitions. What information? Håkon demanded, leaning forward in his seat. Freyja's hand moved to the hidden pouch beneath her garment. My father kept records, she said quietly. Alliances, betrayals, raids planned against settlements to the east, including some not far from here. This revelation sent a new wave of murmurs through the hall. Håkon's expression shifted from skepticism to calculating interest. You're saying Bjorn plans to raid settlements in our region? He asked. Once the spring thaws clear the fjords, Freyja confirmed. His ambition doesn't stop at the northern territories. He seeks to control the entire coastal trade route. Håkon leaned back, his fingers drumming thoughtfully on the arm of his chair. The dynamics had shifted. What had been a simple matter of appeasing a distant power now touches directly on Skjoldheim's security. These records, he said finally. You have them with you? Freyja nodded cautiously. I would examine them, Håkon declared, privately. Then the council will deliberate. Eyvindr stepped forward.
I request to be present for this examination, he said firmly.
As the one who gave her shelter, I have a stake in ensuring her fair treatment. Hakon's mouth thinned with displeasure, but before he could refuse, Gudrun the healer spoke again. A reasonable request, she observed, especially given the circumstances. The girl clearly trusts Eyvindr, and we need her cooperation. After a tense moment, Hakon nodded curtly. Very well. The girl, Eyvindr, and 3 council members will review these supposed records. The rest of you wait here. As the crowd reluctantly settled, Hakon led Freyja and Eyvindr to a smaller chamber adjacent to the main hall. 2 council members followed, Gudrun and Leif, along with one of Hakon's personal guards. Once the heavy door closed behind them, Hakon turned to Freyja. "Show us," he commanded. With slightly trembling hands, Freyja withdrew the leather pouch from beneath her garment. From it, she produced several pieces of vellum, carefully folded and protected by the oiled leather. As she spread them on a table, Eyvindr saw that they were covered in precise runic script, along with drawings of coastlines and settlements. Hakon bent over the documents, his expression intense as he studied the contents. "This is Valkyr's hand?" he asked. "Yes," Freyja confirmed. "My father documented everything, trade agreements, military alliances, betrayals. He believed knowledge was as valuable as silver." "And far more dangerous," Hakon muttered, tracing a finger along a coastline that Eyvindr recognized as their own region. "According to this, Bjorn plans to raid the eastern settlements as soon as the ice breaks, then push south along the coast. Using ships my father was forced to build for him before he was murdered," Freyja added bitterly. Leif the blacksmith leaned closer to examine the documents. "These markings here," he pointed to symbols along the coastline, "what do they indicate?" "Primary targets," Freyja explained. "Settlements with wealth or strategic value." She pointed to a mark not far from their position, including Skjoldheim. The revelation hung heavy in the air. Hakon's face darkened as he absorbed the implications. "If this is true," he said slowly, "we face a significant threat come spring." "It's true," Freyja insisted. "Every word. My father paid for this knowledge with his life." Hakon straightened, his calculating gaze moving from the documents to Freyja and finally to Eyvindr. "This complicates matters," he acknowledged. "It clarifies them," Eyvindr countered. "Handing Freyja to Bjorn's men not only condemns her to death, but deprives us of valuable intelligence that could save lives here." Gudrun nodded in agreement. "The girl must be protected, both for her own sake and for the information she carries." A tense silence filled the small chamber as Hakon considered his options. Eyvindr could almost see the calculations running behind those cold gray eyes, weighing immediate gain against future security, personal power against village survival. "Very well," Hakon finally decided. "The girl remains in Skjoldheim, under council protection." Before Eyvindr could feel relief, Hakon continued, "But not with you, Exile. She'll stay in the village proper, where she can be properly supervised." The implication was clear. Freyja would become a prisoner, her knowledge controlled by Hakon for his own purposes. Eyvindr opened his mouth to protest, but Freyja spoke first. "I will stay," she agreed, surprising everyone, "but on one condition. Eyvindr's exile is suspended. He returns to the village as my protector." Hakon's eyebrows shot up. "You are hardly in a position to make demands, girl." "I'm in exactly such a position," Freyja countered, with unexpected steel in her voice.
These documents mean nothing without my explanation. Symbols, codes, references that only I understand because my father taught me. You need me, cooperative, not captive."
Eyvindr stared at her, impressed by her boldness and quick thinking. She had found the one leverage point Håkon couldn't ignore, his need for the intelligence she possessed. Håkon's face darkened with anger, but Leif spoke before he could respond. "The request is reasonable," the blacksmith observed. "Eyvindr knows her situation better than anyone, and despite his exile, none can question his skill as a warrior. If Bjorn's men return in greater numbers—" "Eyvindr was exiled by full council vote," Håkon reminded them sharply. "That decision cannot undone by a girl's demands." "Not undone," Gudrun suggested diplomatically, "but perhaps temporarily suspended, given the extraordinary circumstances. A probationary return, contingent on his behavior and the current crisis." The suggestion hung in the air, a compromise that would allow Håkon to maintain authority while acknowledging the practical necessity of Eyvindr's involvement. For several long moments, the headman's expression remained stormy, his pride clearly warring with pragmatism. "A temporary suspension," he finally conceded, each word seeming to pain him. "Eyvindr may return to the village until this matter with Bjorn is resolved. But," he added, fixing Eyvindr with a hard stare, "he will swear a new oath of loyalty to the council and to me as its head. Any violation, any challenge to authority, and his original sentence will be immediately reinstated, with the addition of a blade across his throat." The terms were harsh, designed to humiliate as much as control. But Eyvindr recognized the opportunity they represented, not just for him, but for Freyja and potentially the village itself. "I accept," he said simply. Håkon nodded curtly. "Then it's settled. We'll announce the decision to the assembly." As he gathered the documents to return to Freyja, he added, "Remember, exile, your position remains precarious. Don't mistake temporary necessity for forgiveness."
With that warning hanging between them, they returned to the main hall where the villagers waited anxiously. The atmosphere was tense, conversations halting as the small group emerged from the private chamber. Eyvindr noted the varied expressions that greeted their return: curiosity, suspicion, and in a few faces a cautious hope. Håkon took his place at the head of the hall, his authoritative presence immediately commanding attention. "The council has reviewed the evidence presented by Freyja Valkyrsdottir," he announced. "We have determined that her information is of significant value to the security of Skaldheim and surrounding settlements." A murmur ran through the crowd at this unexpected turn. "Therefore," Håkon continued, "she will remain under council protection. Furthermore," he paused, clearly finding the next words distasteful, "given the nature of the threat revealed by her documents, the council has decided to temporarily suspend Eyvindr Braço-de-Ferro's exile. He will serve as the girl's protector and advisor on the matters contained in her father's records." The announcement caused an immediate stir. Eyvindr stood impassively, aware of the many eyes now fixed upon him, some welcoming, others clearly dismayed at his return from isolation. "This decision is not made lightly," Håkon emphasized, raising his voice over the growing murmurs. "It is a temporary measure, responding to extraordinary circumstances. Eyvindr's return is conditional upon his complete compliance with council authority." As the implications of the announcement settled over the assembly, Eyvindr felt a strange mixture of emotions. satisfaction at having achieved some measure of protection for Freyja, wariness of Haakon's continued hostility, and an unexpected sense of homecoming, however tenuous. Beside him, Freyja stood straight-backed and composed, though he could sense the tension radiating from her. She had gambled boldly and won this initial confrontation, but they both knew the danger was far from past. Bjorn's men would return, likely in greater numbers. And within the village itself, Haakon's grudging acceptance of their presence hardly guaranteed safety. As the assembly dispersed, villagers filing out of the hall in small groups, many casting curious or wary glances toward Eyvindr and Freyja, Gudrun approached them. "You'll need lodging," the old healer observed practically. "The girl can stay with me. As for you, Eyvindr—" "He stays with me as well," Freyja interjected firmly. "My protector needs to be close." Gudrun's weathered face creased in a knowing smile. "As you wish. My home is small, but there's room enough." She glanced toward Hakon, who was deep in conversation with his closest advisers. "Best we leave now while attention is elsewhere. The less provocation in these early days, the better." As they followed Gudrun from the hall into the snowy village square, Eyvindr felt the weight of watchful eyes from every doorway and window. His return would be the subject of every conversation tonight, speculation running wild about what had prompted this unprecedented reversal of his sentence. "You took a great risk," he said quietly to Freyja as they walked. "Challenging Hakon directly is rarely wise." "I had nothing left to lose," she replied simply, "and you had risked everything to help me. It seemed only fair to return the favor." Eyvindr studied her profile, struck again by the contrast between her youth and the steel in her character. "Nevertheless, thank you." She glanced at him, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "We're not safe yet. Hakon wants the information I have, but he doesn't care for me, and he certainly doesn't care for you. We've only bought time." "Time is no small thing," Eyvindr observed. "Often it's the difference between life and death." As they reached Gudrun's modest dwelling near the edge of the village, Eyvindr cast one last look back at the hall where he had once presided as Jarl. The path ahead remained dangerous and uncertain, but for the first time since his exile, he felt something stirring within him that he had thought long dead: purpose and perhaps even hope. The next few days passed in a strange limbo of tension and adjustment. Word of Eyvindr's return spread quickly through the village and surrounding farms, bringing the curious and the concerned to Gudrun's door, despite the healer's attempts to maintain privacy. Some came with genuine welcome, old friends or allies who had never fully accepted his exile. Others came to assess the threat he might pose to the current order, reporting back to Hakon, no doubt. Freyja remained mostly secluded, venturing out only when necessary and always with Eyvindr at her side. To the villagers, she was an object of fascination, the northern girl whose arrival had disrupted their careful balance. Few knew the full contents of her father's documents, but rumors spread nonetheless, growing more elaborate with each retelling. Eyvindr found himself navigating a complex web of old relationships and new suspicions. Men who had once fought beside him now greeted him with cautious nods or averted gazes. Women who had sought his judgment in disputes now whispered behind their hands as he passed. Children stared openly, having grown up on tales of the disgraced Jarl who lived in exile beyond the village bounds. Through it all, he maintained a careful distance from Hakon and the council, attending required meetings but speaking only when directly addressed. The temporary nature of his return weighed heavily on him, a sword suspended above his head, ready to fall at the slightest misstep. On the 4th day after their arrival in the village, as weak winter sunlight filtered through clouds, Gunnar appeared at Gudrun's door. The big man embraced Eyvindr roughly, genuine relief evident in his weathered face. "When I saw them taking you to the village, I feared the worst," he admitted, accepting the cup of mead Gudrun offered. "Then to hear you've been granted return, it's more than I dared hope for." "Temporary return," Eyvindr reminded him, though he couldn't help smiling at his friend's enthusiasm. "And not by Hakon's choice." Gunnar's gaze shifted to Freyja, who sat quietly by the hearth, sorting herbs for Gudrun. "You've made quite an impression, young lady. Half the village thinks you're a witch who enchanted the council, and the other half believes you're a princess in disguise." Freyja looked up, startled. "I'm neither, just a survivor, like many others." "With valuable information," Gunnar added, his voice lowering. "Information that has Hakon consulting with messengers and scouts daily." Eyvindra's attention sharpened. "What kind of consultations?" "He's gathering intelligence, verifying the claims in your documents," Gunnar explained. "Traders who've come through, fishermen from the eastern settlements, anyone with news from the north. And he's sent riders to other villages, though what message they carry I couldn't say." "Preparing for Bjorn's spring raids," Eyvindr surmised. "Or perhaps seeking allies against him." "Or both," Gunnar agreed. "But that's not all. Bjorn's men returned yesterday, more than before, and better armed." Freyja stiffened, her hands stilling among the herbs. "Did they come for me?" "They demanded your return, yes. Offered even more for your surrender." Gunnar's expression darkened. There was talk of consequences should Skjoldheim continue to harbor a thief, as they put it. "Did Hakon tell them of the documents?" Eyvindr asked sharply. Gunnar shook his head. "Not directly. He claimed you were being held for questioning about northern clan movements, nothing more. But I doubt they believed him."
Their leader, a hard-faced man with a golden arm ring, he seemed to know exactly what you carried. "Hrolf," Freyja whispered, fear evident in her voice. "Bjorn's right hand, if he's here himself." "They left," Gunnar assured her quickly, "but with a promise to return. Soon, I'd guess." Eyvindr exchanged a worried glance with Gudrun. The situation was escalating faster than they had anticipated. If Bjorn was sending his closest lieutenant, he clearly valued the information Freyja carried, and feared its potential use against him. "We need to prepare," Eyvindr decided, "not just for spring raids, but for immediate conflict. If Hrolf returns with warriors—" "Hakon has increased the village guard," Gunnar reported, "doubled the watches on the approaches. But Skjoldheim is not a fortress, Eyvindr. We're farmers and craftspeople, with a handful of experienced fighters among us." "Then we need to make it a fortress," Eyvindr said grimly, "or at least make it defensible enough to discourage direct assault." Gudrun, who had been listening silently, spoke up. "You speak as though war is inevitable. Perhaps there's another way. Negotiation, compromise." "With men who burned a hall full of guests?" Freyja asked bitterly. "Who slaughtered children in their beds? There's no compromise with Bjorn. He wants total control, and he'll kill anyone who stands in his way." The old healer sighed heavily. "Then we prepare as best we can. But remember, Eyvindr, you walk a narrow path here. Hakon will not welcome military advice from his former rival, no matter how desperately it's needed." "I'm aware," Eyvindr acknowledged, "but I can't stand by and watch Skjoldheim fall unprepared, even if it means risking my position." As darkness fell that evening, Eyvindr was summoned to the council hall.
Freyja insisted on accompanying him, despite his concerns for her safety. "I won't hide while decisions are made about my fate," she declared, with a firmness that brooked no argument.
They found the hall crowded with council members and village elders, the atmosphere tense with suppressed urgency. Hakon sat in his chair of authority, his expression more severe than usual. Beside him stood a man Eyvindr didn't recognize, travel-worn, with the weathered face of a messenger who had ridden hard. "Eyvindr," Hakon acknowledged curtly, "and the girl. Good. You should hear this." He gestured to the stranger. "This is Arne, a scout from Ravnholm to the east. He brings news that concerns us all." Arne stepped forward, his exhaustion evident in the slump of his shoulders. 3 days ago, a raid struck our outlying farms. 20 warriors at least, well armed and organized. They took food, weapons, and captives before withdrawing to their ships. A murmur of alarm ran through the assembly. Raids were not uncommon, but so early in the season, with ice still clogging the fjords, was highly unusual. "Did you see their leader?" Freyja asked, her voice tight with tension. Arne shook his head. "I was not there for the raid itself. I only saw its aftermath." "Were there any identifying marks on the raiders? Symbols, distinctive weapons, or armor?" Eyvindr pressed. "The survivors spoke of warriors with wolves painted on their shields," Arne replied. "And their leader reportedly wore a distinctive helmet, bronze, with the image of a serpent coiled around it." Freyja's sharp intake of breath drew all eyes to her. "Bjorn," she confirmed, her face pale. "The serpent helmet is his signature, worn only in raids he leads personally." Hakon leaned forward, his gaze intense. "You're certain?" "Without doubt," she affirmed. "My father crafted that helmet himself, before he understood Bjorn's true nature." The implications settled heavily over the assembly. If Bjorn was personally leading raids along the coast, months earlier than predicted in Valkyr's documents, the situation was far more dire than they had believed.
"This changes our calculations," Hakon stated, addressing the council. "If Bjorn moves now, rather than waiting for spring, we have little time to prepare." "We need to warn the other settlements," Leif the blacksmith suggested. "Unite our forces." "And risk spreading our defenses too thin?" countered Torsten the miller. "No, we should fortify Skoldheim first, ensure our own survival." As the council erupted into debate, Eyvindr studied Hakon's face. The headman was listening to the arguments, but Eyvindr recognized the look in his eyes. He had already decided on a course of action and was simply allowing the discussion to play out. "What do you propose, Hakon?" Eyvindr asked directly, silencing the competing voices. Hakon's cold gaze shifted to him. "Since you ask, Exile, I propose we use the advantage we currently hold, the girl and her information. Bjorn wants her silenced and the documents destroyed. We can leverage that desire." "Leverage?" Freyja repeated, alarm evident in her voice. "You mean trade me to him?" "Not trade," Hakon corrected smoothly. "Negotiate. Offer terms. Your safe return in exchange for Skoldheim's security and compensation for potential raids." "He'll never honor such terms," Freyja protested. "The moment he has me and the documents, he'll destroy them both, and likely Skoldheim as well, to eliminate any witnesses." "She's right," Eyvindr agreed firmly. "Bjorn Quebra Euramatos earned his name by breaking oaths. Any agreement with him is worthless." Hakon's expression hardened. "Then what would you suggest, Exile, since you seem determined to involve yourself in council decisions despite your tenuous position?"
Eyvindr felt the weight of all eyes upon him. This was the moment Gudrun had warned about, the narrow path between necessary action and provocation. But with lives at stake, he could not remain silent. We prepare for defense while simultaneously reaching out to neighboring settlements.
Not to divide our forces, but to create a united front. Bjorn succeeds by isolating his targets. Together, the coastal villages stand a much better chance. And the girl, Håkon pressed, what of her and her documents? We use the information strategically, Eyvindr proposed. Share selected portions with potential allies to convince them of the threat. Keep Freyja herself secure and hidden. She's the only one who can fully interpret her father's records. The council chamber fell silent as his words were considered. Eyvindr was acutely aware that he had overstepped the boundaries Håkon had set, speaking not as a tolerated exile, but as a strategic advisor, a role too close to his former position as Jarl. To his surprise, it was Gudrun who broke the silence. Eyvindr speaks wisely, the old healer declared. Defense and alliance have always served our people better than appeasement, especially when dealing with oath-breakers. Murmurs of agreement rose from several council members. Håkon's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, the hall doors burst open. One of the village guards stumbled in, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "Attack!" he gasped. "North perimeter! Bjorn's men! They've breached the outer farms!" The hall erupted into chaos. Håkon rose to his feet, barking orders for the village defense to be mustered. Men rushed for weapons, women gathered children, elders moved toward designated shelter areas, all according to long-established protocols for raid response. Eyvindr turned to Freyja, gripping her shoulders firmly. "Go with Gudrun," he instructed. "Stay hidden. If the village falls, head south through the forest path. Avoid the main roads." Her eyes widened with fear and determination. "What about you?" "I'll help defend the village," he replied, already reaching for the axe at his belt. "It's my home, whatever Håkon says." "Be careful," she urged, pressing something into his hand, her father's broken pendant. "For protection." Before he could respond, Gudrun was there, pulling Freyja away toward the healer's hut where they had prepared a hiding place beneath the floor. Eyvindr tucked the pendant into his tunic and turned to find Gunnar at his side, a massive war axe in his hands. "Like old times," the big man observed grimly. "Let's hope not entirely like old times," Eyvindr replied, thinking of past battles lost and the bitter taste of defeat. They moved quickly through the village toward the northern perimeter, joining the hastily assembled defenders. The scene that greeted them confirmed their worst fears. Flames already rose from 2 outlying farmsteads, and the shouts of combat could be heard in the darkness beyond the village proper. Håkon stood with a group of warriors, issuing commands. He paused when he saw Eyvindr approach, wariness and necessity warring in his expression. "You know their tactics," he acknowledged grudgingly. "I've fought northern raiders before," Eyvindr confirmed. "They'll probe for weaknesses, then concentrate their force on the most vulnerable point." "Recommendations?" The question clearly cost Håkon's pride dearly. "Split your forces," Eyvindr advised without hesitation. "Strong defense at the obvious approaches, but keep a mobile reserve to respond to unexpected threats. They'll likely have sent climbers to the eastern ridge to outflank us." Håkon nodded curtly. "Torsten, take 10 men to the eastern slope," he ordered. "The rest of you form defensive positions here and at the southern approach." He turned back to Eyvindr. "You and Gunnar join Leif at the northern barricade. Hold it at all costs." As they moved to their assigned position, Eyvindr felt a strange sense of disorientation. Following Håkon's orders after years of giving his own. Defending a village that had cast him out. fighting alongside men who had once been his loyal warriors. But beneath the confusion burned a clarity of purpose he had not felt since before his exile. Whatever had happened between them, these were still his people. This was still his home. The northern barricade was little more than a hastily reinforced fence with a ditch before it, manned by Life and a handful of villagers armed with spears and shields. Beyond it, the darkness was broken by the glow of burning buildings and the occasional flicker of torches moving through the night. "How many?" Eyvindr asked as he took position beside Life. 20, perhaps 30 from what the scouts reported, the blacksmith replied grimly. "Well armed, with archers for support." "And our strength?" 40 fighters total, but only half with real combat experience. The rest are farmers with hunting spears and woodcutting axes. Eyvindr nodded, assessing their position. The barricade offered some protection, but it wouldn't withstand a determined assault for long. Their advantage lay in knowledge of the terrain and the defensive position. "Have the archers target their torchbearers," he suggested. "Force them to attack in darkness. It will slow their coordination." Life nodded, relaying the order to the few villagers with bows. The defenders settled into tense waiting, the only sounds the distant crackle of flames and the occasional shout carried on the wind. Then it began. A horn blast from the darkness, followed by war cries that chilled the blood. Shapes emerged from the night, running figures carrying shields and weapons, moving with the practiced coordination of experienced raiders. "Hold!" Eyvindr shouted as the defenders tensed. "Wait until they reach the ditch." The attackers came in a wave, their momentum carrying them forward, until the first line plunged unexpectedly into the concealed ditch before the barricade. As they stumbled and fell, Eyvindr gave the signal. "Now, archers!" Arrows whistled through the night air, finding targets among the disorganized raiders. Screams rose as men fell, but the attack continued, warriors clambering over their fallen comrades to reach the barricade. The first raider to scale the barrier met Gunnar's axe, his head nearly severed by the powerful blow. Beside him, Eyvindr thrust his spear through an opening, feeling it connect with flesh. Leif and the other defenders held their positions, repelling the initial assault with desperate courage. For several minutes, the battle hung in balance. Raiders attempting to breach the barricade, defenders fighting to hold them back. Blood slickened the wooden stakes, and the air filled with the sounds of combat, metal on metal, the thud of weapons finding flesh, the cries of the wounded and dying. Then from somewhere to their right came the sound Eyvindr had been dreading, shouts of alarm from the eastern slope. Haakon's voice rose above the clamor, calling for the reserve to respond to the new threat. The flanking maneuver Eyvindr had predicted was underway. "They're trying to split our attention," he shouted to Leif. "Hold here, don't let them draw defenders away from this position." Even as he spoke, the pressure on their barricade intensified. A massive raider with a double-headed axe hacked at the wooden stakes, creating an opening that others rushed to exploit. Eyvindr moved to meet the threat, his own axe singing through the air to bury itself in the man's chest. But for each raider who fell, another seemed to take his place. The battle descended into chaos, a desperate struggle of individual combats along the failing barricade. Eyvindr lost track of time, his world narrowing to the immediate needs of survival. Parry, strike, move, repeat. Blood stung his eyes from a gash on his forehead, and his left arm hung awkwardly where a blade had found the gap in his leather armor.
Through the confusion, he caught glimpses of the larger battle. Gunnar standing like a bear over a fallen defender, keeping raiders at bay. Leif fighting back-to-back with a young farmer. Haakon leading a charge against raiders who had breached the eastern defenses. Then, cutting through the din of battle, came a sound that froze Eyvindr's blood. A woman's scream, coming from the direction of Gudrun's hut. Freyja. Without conscious thought, he disengaged from his current opponent, smashing the man's face with the haft of his axe before turning to run toward the sound. The village center was in chaos, buildings burning, people fleeing, fighters engaged in scattered combat. Gudrun's hut appeared intact, but the door stood open, spilling light into the night. As Eyvindr approached, he heard voices within, a man's harsh and commanding, and Gudrun's defiant despite obvious pain. He burst through the doorway to find the old healer on the floor, blood seeping from a wound to her temple. Standing over her was a warrior unlike the others, taller, his armor finer, a golden arm ring gleaming in the firelight. Hrolf, Bjorn's lieutenant. The man turned at Eyvindr's entrance, a cold smile spreading across his face. "The Exiled Jarl," he observed. "Bjorn will be pleased when I bring him both the girl and your head." "Where is she?" Eyvindr demanded, his axe raised. Hrolf's smile widened. "The little thief? Hiding, I imagine. But not for long." He gestured around the small hut. "This place offers few secrets." Relief flooded through Eyvindr. They hadn't found Freyja yet. The hidden space beneath the floorboards still concealed her. But that relief was short-lived, as Hrolf moved suddenly, his sword slashing toward Eyvindr's throat. The confined space of the hut limited both men's movements. Eyvindr parried the blow with his axe handle, the impact sending shocks of pain through his injured arm. He countered with a low sweep aimed at Hrolf's legs, but the warrior leapt back, knocking over a table of Gudrun's healing supplies. "You fight well for a disgraced Jarl," Hrolf taunted, circling warily. "But you're wounded, tired. I am neither." It was true. The battle had taken its toll on Eyvindr. Blood loss and exhaustion slowed his reactions, while Hrolf seemed fresh, having likely held back from the main assault specifically to search for Freyja. "Surrender the girl," Hrolf continued, "and perhaps Bjorn will grant Skjoldheim mercy. Resist, and he'll burn this village as he burned Valkyr's hall." "If Bjorn wants her," Eyvindr replied through gritted teeth, "he can come himself instead of sending his dog." Rage flashed across Hrolf's face. He attacked with renewed fury, his sword a blur of deadly motion. Eyvindr defended desperately, giving ground, using the hut's furnishings as obstacles to slow his opponent's advance. A misstep on the uneven floor nearly cost him his life. He stumbled, and Hrolf's blade sliced along his ribs, drawing a fresh line of blood. Eyvindr fell back against the wall, his breathing labored, axe raised in a final defensive posture. Hrolf advanced for the kill, confidence evident in his measured stride. "Your death will be quick," he promised. "The girl's will not." As he raised his sword for the final blow, a section of the floor behind him suddenly lifted. Freyja emerged from her hiding place, Gudrun's iron cooking pot in her hands. With all her strength, she brought it crashing down on Hrolf's head. The warrior staggered, momentarily stunned by the unexpected attack. It was all the opening Eyvindr needed. Summoning his remaining strength, he lunged forward, driving his axe deep into Hrolf's chest. The lieutenant's eyes widened in shock and denial. His sword clattered to the floor as he grasped futilely at the axe embedded in his body. Blood bubbled from his lips as he tried to speak, but only a gurgling sound emerged. Then he collapsed, his life flowing out onto Gudrun's earthen floor. Eyvindr sagged against the wall, the last of his strength deserting him. Freyja rushed to his side, supporting him as he slid to the floor. "You're hurt," she said, her hands already moving to examine his wounds. "Gudrun," he managed to say, gesturing toward the unconscious healer. Freyja moved to check on the old woman. "She's alive," she reported with relief. "The blow knocked her senseless, but her breathing is strong." Outside, the sounds of battle were changing. Fewer clashes of weapons, more shouted commands, and the retreat of running feet. The tide had turned, the defense holding. "We need to get you both to safety," Freyja insisted, tearing strips from her own clothing to bind Eyvindr's wounds. "The fighting may return this way." "No," Eyvindr said firmly, despite the pain clouding his vision. "With Rolf dead, they'll retreat. He was their leader, their strongest fighter. Without him, they have no center." As if to confirm his words, a horn sounded in the distance. 3 short blasts, the signal for withdrawal. The raiders were pulling back, taking their wounded and whatever spoils they had managed to seize. Freyja finished binding his wounds as best she could, then moved to tend to Gudrun. The old healer was beginning to stir, groaning softly as consciousness returned. "You saved my life," Eyvindr said quietly, watching Freyja work. "You could have remained hidden, stayed safe." She glanced at him, her expression solemn. "You risked everything for me when I was a stranger. How could I do less for you?" Before he could respond, the door burst open again. Gunnar stood there, bloodied but standing, relief washing over his face at the sight of them alive. "The raiders are retreating," he reported. "We've held the village." His gaze fell on Rolf's body, eyes widening in recognition. "Bjorn's second! You killed him?" "We killed him," Eyvindr corrected, nodding toward Freyja.
She struck the first blow. Gunnar's expression shifted to one of newfound respect as he regarded the young woman. "Then we owe you a debt, Freyja Valkyrsdottir. With Rolf dead, Bjorn has lost his strongest arm and his most trusted advisor." "He'll come himself now," she predicted grimly. "This failure will make it personal." "Let him come," Gunnar declared fiercely. "We'll be ready." More villagers arrived, helping to move Eyvind and Gudrun to the great hall where the wounded were being treated. The village had suffered, buildings burned, fields trampled, good people injured or killed. But they had survived, repelled the attack, dealt Bjorn a significant blow. As dawn broke over Skoldheim, painting the smoke-filled sky with hues of pink and gold, Eyvindr found himself propped against a pillar in the great hall, watching the village slowly recover its breath. Healers moved among the wounded, children were reunited with parents, warriors cleaned blood from their weapons and armor. Håkon approached, his own face bearing a fresh scar from the night's fighting. For a long moment, the two men regarded each other in silence, former rivals united by common threat, divided by history. "You fought well," Håkon finally acknowledged. "Your strategy with the Eastern Ridge saved many lives." "As did your leadership," Eyvindr returned evenly. "The village held because its people stood together." Another silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Then Håkon said something Eyvindr never expected to hear. "I was wrong." The admission seemed physically painful for the headman. About the girl, about the threat. "If we had tried to negotiate with Bjorn as I proposed." "We can't know what might have happened," Eyvindr replied, surprising himself with the lack of recrimination in his voice. "We can only move forward from here." Håkon nodded slowly. "Forward, then. The council will meet at midday to discuss our next steps. I would value your input."
It wasn't quite an apology, nor a full restoration of status, but in Håkon's grudging request, Eyvindr recognized something significant, a shift in the village's dynamics, a crack in the wall that had separated him from his people.
"I'll be there," he promised. As Håkon moved away to continue organizing the village's recovery, Freyja appeared at Eyvindra's side, a cup of water in her hands. She had washed the blood from her face and bound her hair back neatly, though exhaustion still shadowed her eyes. "How are your wounds?" she asked, offering him the cup. "Painful, but not fatal," he assured her, drinking deeply. "Thanks to you." She settled beside him, her shoulder brushing his uninjured side. "I heard what Håkon said. It seems you're no longer quite so exiled." "Perhaps not," he agreed cautiously, "though one battle doesn't erase years of bitterness." "No," she acknowledged, "but it's a beginning, for both of us." They sat in companionable silence, watching the village come to life around them. People moved with purpose now, rebuilding what was damaged, strengthening what had held. The fear remained. Bjorn would come, bringing greater force next time. But it was tempered by something new: confidence, unity, resolve. "What will you do," Eyvindr asked finally, "when this is over, if we survive Bjorn's vengeance?" Freyja considered the question, her gaze distant. "I don't know," she admitted. "For so long, survival was my only goal. I never thought beyond the next day, the next meal, the next safe place to hide." She looked around the hall, at the people working together to heal their community. "But watching this village, watching you, I'm starting to believe in something more than just survival." "What's that?" "Belonging," she said simply. "Finding a place where your presence matters, where you're part of something larger than yourself." Her eyes met his, surprisingly vulnerable. "Is that possible, do you think, for people like us who've lost everything?" Eyvindr thought of the long, lonely months of his exile, the bitterness that had nearly consumed him. Then he looked at the hall where he had once presided as Jarl, different now, changed as he was changed, but still standing, still home. "Yes," he said, with quiet certainty, "I believe it is." As the sun rose higher over Skjoldheim, casting its light on the damage and the renewal, Eyvindr felt something shift within him, a weight lifting, a door opening. The worst fate of an exiled Jarl, he realized, wasn't the loss of power or position. It was the loss of purpose, of connection to something beyond oneself. In the arrival of one frightened stranger, in the defense of a village that had once rejected him, he had found his way back to that essential truth. Whatever came next, Bjorn's vengeance, the village's future, his own path forward, would be faced not in isolation, but in community. Not in bitterness, but in hope. And in that realization, despite his wounds and the dangers still to come, Eyvindr Braço-de-Ferro found a peace he had thought forever beyond his reach.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe. We're just getting started and we really need your support. And may the gods grant you a legendary life.